Dr. Jazz.
Yeah, thank you for having me here.
Oh man, thanks for taking the time. I have you on so many records, and I basically spoke to so many guys you've played with. So you know.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So I love the Chicago '90s stuff that was happening, and later on. And
sure. Yeah.
So, but I'll just jump in. I wanted to ask you. I listened to. You've been incredibly busy, right? And I listened to the last one on Not Two Records with Joe Morris and Nate McBride. And
oh yeah,
it's so cool, man. Like,
thank you.
How did that one happen? Like, is there was just a session, or like, is there more?
Yeah, Joe set it up. Actually, what happened was, I guess he had kind of. Hold on, I'm going to grab one thing. Hold on.
Sure.
Joe had, I think, fairly recently gotten like some recording equipment at his home. He lives near New Haven in Connecticut, and we were just both at a show in Boston together, and I actually ended up sitting next to him, and we were checking this show out. I think it was Tony Malaby playing with Francisco Mela and some other people.
Beautiful.
And maybe James Paul Nadian was playing too. I can't remember exactly, but it was at that music shop Virtuosity in Boston, which was having shows for a while. Anyway, Joe was just like, "Hey, why don't you and Nate come down to my place and we'll do some recording?" And I was like, "Okay." So he just put it out there at this show, and so I made some emails and we set a date, and it turned out to be great. Nate McBride and I drove down from Boston to New Haven, and which is a little bit of a drive, but not too far. And we just had a great day. Got there. Joe's place is kind of outside the town. It's kind of, you'd almost say it's in the woods. I mean, it's a neighborhood. There's houses around and stuff, but there's a lot of trees. He has a really cool place with like a big rock outcropping up on a hill behind it, which made its way into the titles of the tracks, because we took a break and went out there and kind of climbed up on the rock and hung out up there and stuff, and then after we were done, we went into New Haven and we wanted to get some pizza because, the famous New Haven beats. So, and Joe knows all about that. So we tried a couple of the classic places in town and they were too busy. So we went out to Zapardi's, which is actually, I think it's West Haven. It's like just outside New Haven, but another one of the classic places called Zapardi's, and we ended up going there and we got some pizza and took it over to the beach. We're close to the water, so we just walked over there. Yeah, and we had pizza out on the beach. So it was a really nice day. We were talking about all kinds of stuff driving around. Yeah. And then the session went really well. We just recorded a bunch of stuff. We listened back to some of it on the spot and was like, okay, this sounds good. And the record, I think, is just, it's just like everything we did in the order we did it. I'm pretty sure. It's just like,
oh, beautiful, man. Yeah.
That's what we played that day. Yeah.
Did you ever play before with Joe? I mean, I'm not with Nate. I know you did, but with Joe.
Oh, Nate, I played a ton. Yeah, and then Joe had played some. Yeah, over the years, not as much as with Nate, but some. Yeah, back in Chicago, he would when he first. Well, I want to say first started, but he would come to Chicago starting in the must have been late '90s, early 2000s. After I had started to be active here, and we got to play some then, and there was a large group. Which was like a collaboration between Chicago and Scandinavian musicians. And Joe also got invited to be part of that. So that was like this huge 14-piece thing or something. And there's a recording of that. And we did a tour one time in Sweden. We got some money. Yeah, this was all like way back 1999 or 2000, something like that. And so we played together on that. I'm trying to remember now. It was called Pipeline. That was the name of the project. And there actually is a record. The recording took forever to come out for whatever reason, but it actually did come out just like a few years ago. on John Corbett versus Dempsey label.
Okay, I have to find it. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, it's a beautiful one. I wanted to start the talk with this because it's nice to hear you guys play. So
yeah. Well, Joe's playing drums on that, so we had done some gigs not too long before that. There's a place in New Haven, a Middle Eastern restaurant called Tea in Sahara, which shows the guy who runs it is a fan of the music, and it's this really cool little restaurant, and you just set up in there, and there's people eating, and you just play, and you can play. He likes out stuff, so he has like regular shows there, and there's people eating dinner, and we're sitting there playing this pretty out music in the middle of people, and then he gives you really good food afterwards too. So.
Yeah, that's all worth it, right?
Yeah, so we had played there with Joe playing drums, and that was the first time I played with Joe on drums for sure. And that was the session he wanted to do a recording with us with him playing drums. Yeah,
I'm just waiting until he picks up the trombone. He played the double bass and guitar, and it's just like, okay. It's bound to happen or something.
For real,
yeah.
Yeah, he's probably got more tricks up his sleeve.
I think so too.
Yeah.
But you sent me also the SoundCloud of the trombone trio. That's
right.
And you guys are. I checked on your website. You have quite a long tour. for current circumstances.
Yeah,
considering it's a trombone trio. So, like, what's the story behind?
The story behind the group. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah.
You mean,
yeah, sure. Yeah.
We started in, it would have been 2000. I'm not even sure anymore, 16 or 17 or maybe 18. I think 17. We had a gig booked. It was supposed to be a quartet with Johannes Bauer, and this was Johannes was ill, and we knew that he had this long-term illness, but he was still playing, and we booked this gig several months ahead of time in Cologne, and then he eventually let us know that he was too ill to do it. He wouldn't be able to make the gig. And then it turned out the day of the gig was the day that he passed away. So, which was a, weird, one of those things that happens sometimes, I guess. So we did the show, of course, the three of us, and we dedicated it to him. And there's a live recording of that. And that was our first CD that came out also on Not To. And then not long after that, we did a tour. We decided we wanted to continue the group, just as an ongoing project. So we did a tour in Europe in 2019 that those guys put together. I think that was like 11 dates, and we played a couple of festivals.
Oh, wow, beautiful.
And it was a really successful tour, and we had a great time. And another recording came out of that from live recordings in Antwerp at the Summer Bummer Festival and in Berlin at the club there. And blanking on the name of, but it's a club that is not there anymore now, I think. Anyway, those live recordings are the second CD of ours, and that's the one I sent you the SoundCloud link to. It's called From A to B.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. And so then we wanted to do a U.S. tour. That seemed like the next step. So those guys got some grant money to help pay for the travel and cover everything. And I've been working on putting these dates together and trying to get everything covered. So.
Nice.
So that's coming up pretty soon. I think it's going to be a blast. Yeah, we're going to drive. Sure, yeah.
Nice hanging. 3 trombones. Come on.
It's a really fun group to play with, And for a long time, I had this kind of. Years ago, I had this kind of aversion to doing like multiple trombone projects because it's kind of a thing like. There's trombone bands and these records of all trombones playing stuff, and I just kind of had this feeling like, well, the trombone is almost viewed like this thing where, they're gonna want you to put a bunch of them together, and it's gonna be, I don't know, it's hard to explain, but I had this kind of aversion to doing that. But then I got over that basically, and now I really like it. And it's not about the instrument; it's about the musician, right?
Sure,
it's about. And with this particular group, we find all kinds of a huge range of territory to cover, and then different kinds of sounds and textures. And we all have, I think, pretty compatible ideas about improvising. And it can really go anywhere So it's all kinds of things with mutes and extended techniques and air and sound and, yeah, it's just really always really exciting to play with those guys. So I think musically it really works as a band is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, you've done quite some touring now and 2 albums, and that's where you can start calling it a band, I guess. So
yeah, right. Yeah,
definitely.
It's like a working group.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you one thing, which is like, I found out about your playing with Ken Vandermark wife, like which was mid-90s, and you were like amazing on guitar and trombone, and then I've read you played also bass before, like which is very similar to Curtis Hasselbrink. Actually, he's a trombonist and guitarist. Like, funny enough. But what's your story here with 2 instruments, basically 3? I mean, how did you start doing all of this? I mean,
well, I was a trombone player first, and I did that in public schools, and I got to where I was taking it pretty seriously, and I wanted to try to have a career as a classical trombone player. So when I went off to college, it was at Northwestern University, and I was majoring in classical trombone performance. So I did 2 years of that, and I got halfway through the undergraduate degree, but I got to where I was pretty dissatisfied with. It didn't appeal to me as much anymore. And I mean, this is thinking back to when I was like 19 years old, so it's almost hard for me to remember even my thought processes. But in any case, I didn't want to be a classical trombone player. So I left that and I went back to my native North Carolina. And I was an engineering major for a minute because there's a good engineering school there, and I didn't know what else. Wow. Yeah. But at the same time, I got involved. There was this like sort of underground, very like punk rock scene that there in North Carolina. This was the early 80s.
Yeah, sure.
And that was just kind of, like what they called hardcore punk at the time. Maybe people still call it that. And I started finding out about that, and I got really interested in that. And I guess partly it must have been a rejection of my classical background,
sure.
But I really, it really caught my ear, like the really underground raw character of it, the fact that it was people making their own culture, kind of rejecting what they were being handed by, corporate America, and saying, no, that sucks. We want to do our own thing. And this is us. This is our expression. And the underground nature of it. I liked all that, and so I got a bass guitar, and, it wasn't too hard to learn basic rudiments of it, right? Especially if you have a music background already. So and a friend of mine was a guitarist, this guy, Gary Hess, he had dropped out of Berkeley like a year earlier. And he was an old friend of mine from school and everything. But, so we got together and we were also like kind of playing like real book tunes and stuff, in my parents' basement. We were like, I was partly trying to learn how to like do walking bass on tunes and stuff like that. But also we formed this punk rock band pretty fast and started doing that. So fast forward a few years, I went away to school in Europe for a year. I came back and I wanted to, the music scene around Raleigh was getting really interesting. It was like a bunch of musicians had come up and their bands were like exploring different kinds of music, and I wanted to be part of that. So I started playing guitar also.
Okay. And
kept playing bass and started playing guitar and just started playing with a lot of musicians around there. And for the next few years, that's what I did. So I was playing. I wasn't working on the trombone at all. I had the trombone and I would play it here and there a little bit. And eventually I started playing it a little more. But really for like quite a few years there, I really didn't work on the trombone or play it much at all. Yeah. And then I went away to graduate school. This was all in philosophy, by the way. I quit engineering after like a year, and I got interested in philosophy. So I studied philosophy for a while. Okay. Wow. And I went to graduate school in philosophy, first in Arizona and then in Chicago. And I didn't even take the trombone with me. I really didn't play the trombone at all for a while. And then in Chicago, I quit graduate school because I realized I didn't want to be a philosophy professor either. So, but I had started to check out the music around Chicago. So there was a place called Club Lower Links, which is a really good place to see, you know, any kind of experimental or avant-garde stuff. And that's probably where I saw Ken Vandermark play for the first time. It was either there or Lounge Acts. And I saw Fred Anderson play at Lower Links, and there were lots of shows that came through there that I saw that were really great. And when I'd been in Europe previously, I'd seen some really good shows over there that really got me interested in the kind of stuff I do now. Like I saw the Braxton Quartet with, even before Mark Dressa was in it. So it was John Lindbergh on bass, and Marilyn Crispell and Jerry Hemingway. And I saw Ornette Coleman's Primetime. I saw an AACM affiliated group with Don Moyer and Joseph Sharman, with Craig Harris on trombone and Adasiewicz on bass. I saw Steve Lacy play a duo with Ulrich Gumpert, East German piano player. So I saw all this stuff also when I was like in Belgium, and that really like got me interested in things too. So you put all that together, and eventually I dropped out of grad school in Chicago, and I wanted to play music, and there was stuff happening around. And at that time, you know, even then, I think I didn't have a trombone with me right at the very beginning there. And I wanted to play guitar and bass, you know, so I was doing that. But pretty quickly it became obvious. I was like, okay, I don't really know how to play these instruments. You know, I'd self-taught myself a certain amount of stuff on it, but I'd never really like put in a lot of work on fundamentals, or I couldn't play jazz at all really, but there was like this whole jazz component to what was going on. And I was like, you know, I should get the trombone because I understand how to play the trombone, right? So I got my trombone back, and I started working on that again and started reintroducing that. And, you know, at some point it got to where that came back pretty well, you know, I still remembered how to do it. But I had completely different ideas in my head about what I wanted music to sound like, what I wanted the trombone to sound like. I had heard all these different things. So it was completely different space from when I was a classical trombone performance undergraduate, right? So yeah, that's kind of the story.
But with the trombone, so you basically you never went like through, let's say, J.J. Johnson, Russell Rudd, that you checked out all those jazz guys basically, or later.
I mean, yeah, I had always been, I'd been interested in listening to jazz even way back in the day, you know. But when I was like a classical guy, jazz to me meant more like big band stuff or something. You know? But I would go like to Jazz Showcase in Chicago and see shows. Some, you know, I wasn't like a huge, I mean, I was a classical musician, right? It was my focus. And then the school I was at didn't have a jazz program. They did bring like a guy in from outside to sort of do fundamentals of jazz harmony and improvising for students who were interested in that. So I did do some of those kind of seminars. So I learned a tiny bit that way. And I took a jazz arranging course, and I did like a jazz arrangement for a big band of a J.J. Johnson piece. So there was that. So I like dealt with writing for a big band and dealing with like the, you know, voicing the harmonies and all that stuff, you know. So I had like a little bit. I didn't have any real training or experience, but I had it in my ear, and I had some knowledge of it. And I, you know, was listening. The thing is, after I quit the classical thing and I went back to North Carolina, I was picking up records, but right away my attention really went to more avant-garde stuff for whatever reason. So, and I mean, I would pick up some more, you know, older conventional, what you could call straight ahead recordings too, and listen to that. But my attention was more drawn to the newer stuff for whatever reason. So that was where I started. And then over the years, I mean, I've kind of gone back and collected a lot more records of, you know, that cover the whole history of jazz, and I've listened to a lot more of that stuff. But to answer your question more directly, no, I never had a phase as a player where I went through like, I never like sat down and studied how to play bebop or transcribe J.J. Johnson solos or any of that stuff, you know. I mean, later I did transcribe a couple of J.J. Johnson solos, but, you know, but not a ton, not a lot. I never spent a lot of time working on that stuff.
Interesting. So
I came to it through like a different door, and then kind of whatever knowledge I have of older stuff came kind of later, and it's very like whatever I decided to pay attention to and pick up. It doesn't come from any kind of school or academic background at all.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I mean, because when I listen to you, like on those early Ken Vandermark 5 recordings, it's like you have this other thing also on and later, you know, with Joe McPhee or Fred Lonberg or wherever. I guess maybe this comes from that you came from classical world, basically learned the techniques, but made your own story. So that's beautiful. Yeah. I mean, how did you meet? How did you end up in Ken's band actually? And that band became like in the late 90s. You must have toured like all the time, right? I mean, what's the story with Ken?
We were touring a fair amount for sure. Yeah. So 2, maybe 3 times a year sometimes. Wow. I mean, I met Ken. I think I introduced myself to him after one of the shows I saw him at in Chicago. And so we decided to get together and try playing. And at first it was with like Kevin Drum and Weasel Walter, you know, we just got together at Kevin's place and improvised. And I wasn't playing trombone. I was just playing, I think, just guitar actually.
Oh, wow.
So there were a couple of sessions like that. And then it turned out Weasel had this group that Ken was in for a minute, the Flying Lutenbachers, like very early version of that. That group still exists, but it's gone through a ton of transformations. But you know, at the time, it was another band that I saw back around then. I was like, wow, this is pretty interesting. Like my way of thinking of it was like this garage free jazz kind of thing. It was like, it was like this free jazz, but very, you know, kind of minimalistic almost in a way. Or I'm not sure how to put it, but it clearly had those elements in it. So they wanted a bass player. So I was like, well, I play electric bass. So I ended up playing bass in that. And that was my first regular thing in Chicago. And we did a fair amount with that. We made 2 records. We did a tour. We played in Chicago a lot. And Ken left that band pretty quickly, but so it continued without him for a while. And then it broke up, and then other things happened. But that was all even before, you know, that was all over by 95, I think. Already. And then I went away for a few months in 95, spent the summer in New York City. And then I came back, and then, you know, I guess I was looking for stuff to do, but Ken asked me if I wanted to be part of this new thing he was starting, which was Vandermark 5. So that started. Okay. Yeah, it started. I think our first performance was early in 1996. I think that's right.
Yeah. And then those records came out, Single Piece Flow, and
there was a whole string of records after that.
Yeah, that's like Oh wow.
Yeah.
What's your view on what was happening, like this renaissance in Chicago? I think late 90s, the sense that I get, you know, all of a sudden you guys started to play so much, traveling a lot to Europe, like musicians from Europe started to come to Chicago.
Yeah, well, the Europe connection was due a lot to John Corbin and Ken organizing shows. And it became, and, you know, and at that time, especially John had a lot of knowledge and connection on some level with European musicians. And it just like quickly became a thing where the European guys were like, yeah, there's like a good gig in Chicago, you know? And the scene at the time was like, with the way things developed, there were like people in the press who were interested in the music and would give it, like, would write about it in a way that would attract audiences.
Yeah.
John and Ken were like seeking out non-traditional venues, like rock clubs, like the Empty Bottle was the first main one. And part of the idea was to try to get a younger audience interested in the music, you know, and that plus the press really worked, you know. I mean, people were coming to the shows and there was like a buzz about it. There was a lot of cross-pollination between that scene and then like rock scenes in Chicago. People didn't think in terms, the walls weren't very high, you know, so there was a lot of friendly interest between the different kinds of, you know, people doing different kinds of music, including like new music to some extent, and then the rock stuff, and there were, you know, people from what you would call the straight ahead jazz scene who had like involvements in that world too. There was some interest between those. I mean, there's always walls there in different between those scenes, it seems like. But in even in Chicago, even that wall was not as, it was more porous than it is in some other places, it seems. So there was this really, what I would say was a healthy sense of people being interested in seeing what you could make out of putting all that stuff together,
yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. And plus, you know, especially at first in this corner of Chicago we're talking about, which is really just a corner of a much bigger thing. John and Ken were doing a lot of work to make stuff happen and promote things. And pretty soon there was an Empty Bottle Festival, and the European connections grew. I mean, I met a lot of guys from Europe that way because they would come through and I would often play with them. Pretty often I would put them up at my apartment because they needed a place to stay. So I met a lot of people that way, and then things, you know, connections formed that continued over the years.
Yeah. One of these connections was like, you know, with Peter Brötzmann. I think you established an amazing one. I mean, the tentet, obviously, one of the things which was hugely important. I think. Like, what was your story with Peter? I mean, the first time you met him and playing with him, being such a force, actually.
Right. That that connection again was really due to John Corbett, I think, who was already friends with Peter, had interviewed him and knew his music well, and Peter had first been to Chicago, I think not that long before that. This was a little bit before my time, but there used to be a place called South End Music Works in Chicago, run by Leo Feigen, I believe, who later did Leo Records. Yeah. I think it's the same guy. And Peter came to Chicago and played there with Hamid Drake. I think they played a duo.
Oh wow!
But again, this was all like just before the beginning of my involvement there. So I never went to South End Music Works, and I didn't see that show. But I think that was the beginning of Peter's, like, that, what turned into that long-standing Chicago connection. So then they hatched this idea of having Peter come and do a project with a larger group with Chicago players. And at first it was an 8-piece band, and it was like, you know, Chicago people plus, I think Mats Gustafsson was part of it.
Yeah.
Even then, I think, was Mats in the beginning? I'm not sure. If it was 8, it was what? Michael Zarang, Hamid, Hamid, Michael,
Fred, right?
Fred, Ken, Mars, me. That's 6. Kent Kessler at 7, and Peter is 8. Is 8. Yeah. So then I guess Mats got added later. So Mats was 9, and then what was it? Joe McPhee, I guess, made it 10. And then later we did a tour. Roy Campbell and William Parker were part of it for one tour, so it was 12. At some point, Hamid left and Paul Nilsson Love came in.
Yeah.
So there were never 3 drummers, but it was, but Paul got involved at some point, and then Roebke Holmlander on tuba came in.
Yeah, exactly.
And so there were some little shifts around, but it settled on being 10 or 11 people. Johannes Bauer. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the time it was actually 11 people, but we just kept calling it the Tentet because Peter said it sounded better to call it a Tentet.
How was it like playing with him? I mean, like, regarding the intensity and...
Yeah, I mean, when you actually played with Peter, one thing you realized right away was that he's like a very quick and astute listener. So he's really, I mean, he's, you know, really in the moment, listening and making the music with you right there. Yeah. I mean, and that's something that I realized more after actually playing with him. And we also, you know, outside the Tentet, we did like duo gigs a few times, just him and me. Oh
wow, really? Oh man.
Yeah. I don't think I even have. I might have a recording of one of them, a live recording.
That must have been intense.
We did that through. It was hard to get through, actually. But sometimes there were times when I felt like it worked really well, and then a lot of times it felt like it was really, really hard work.
Sure.
Just physically, you know. And that's probably partly due to me. I probably approached it too much that way or something, you know. And there was a smaller, like a 6-piece group with Peter and me and I think Ingebrigt and Michael.
Oh, wow, beautiful.
And one other bass player. Oh, Frank Rosaly was 2 drummers. Frank was in it. Yeah. And that sextet played in Chicago a couple of times.
Wow.
So anyway, having played with Peter in a few different contexts, the main thing is that, it was really about the communication was very evident when you played with him,
Yeah.
and the total commitment and the energy, it was just like, but even if, it wasn't at all about being like loud and blasting all the time, that cliche about Peter probably still persists, but that was part of it, sure, but it wasn't by any means the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's always this I guess one thing about Peter's music is, which I liked a lot and like a lot, is that it's devoid of ornamentation in a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like it's always about the direct,
yeah,
musical communication, and there's no little, like kind of decorative things that are put on it or adornments or anything like that. It has this very direct, I want to say raw, I guess you could say, quality. And you see that in his visual art too, I think. Mm-hmm. His visual art to me doesn't have like any kind of decorative or embellishment quality about it. It's just like this, okay, here's this idea, and it's like very directly put,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, probably comes from the history, coming from obviously East Germany and different cultural background. And but I love the stuff you did, the tentat. I mean, that's amazing.
Thank you.
Great music,
Yeah, when it worked, it was really an amazing group. I would say there were times when it didn't work, just because trying to do, especially when it was a free improvising band.
Oh man, sure, yeah.
Free improvising with that many musicians is just a huge challenge to make it coherent and to have the whole overall thing work. And also a lot of times with a band like that, the acoustics of the space that you're in make a huge difference.
That's a different.
So there were some rooms that worked really well, and then some that really, we'd show up sometimes for these festival situations or something, and you'd be in this situation where it just wasn't a good acoustic situation for that band, And we could make something happen, but it limited the possibilities a lot. But playing somewhere like the BIM House, for example, was a really good place for that group, because the acoustics are really good and the stage is big enough that you have flexibility to move around. And that became a thing with that group, the ability for those of us who could to actually physically move around on the stage. And that way you could create different like little coalitions or subgroupings on the fly, and that was a huge part of the particular freedom that group had to create different kinds of things. And sometimes you could really get into these things where you'd have like more than one different thing going on at once, so you'd have this one little temporary formation over here and then a different one over here, and they could be doing like basically unrelated things, I always liked it when that happened. I thought that was a really interesting structural possibility of the band. But to work, you have to have like a room that lets you do that physically and acoustically. So that was tough. Another good one was the place in Wuppertal, Cafe Ada.
Oh yeah, exactly.
The upstairs space there. That was really good for that.
Yeah. There are some cool places like that in venues, in Europe. So. Yeah. How did you, in the midst of all that? I mean, I love those Oka discs you made, the trio, and the later one, Afternoons with Jeff Parker.
Jeff Parker was in that,
How did those happen and you becoming a band leader? What's the story behind there? I love those records, by the way. And
thank you. Yeah.
Really cool.
Afternoons I don't think about much anymore. I never listen. I never even listened to those records, man. I haven't listened to that first trio record in 15 years or something.
Oh, sure.
But I'm glad it's there.
Yeah.
How did it happen? I mean, I wanted to try writing some tunes, and I had some ideas, and I was playing with Tim and Kent in the Vandermark 5, and they were like kind of the guys I knew, really. This was all pretty early on in my involvement in this stuff in Chicago, and I just hadn't met a lot of people, for one thing. But I really liked playing with those guys, so I was like, okay, so we did that. And I guess it was, again, this is thinking back a long time, but I wanted to create a context where I could stretch out more, but within the framework of a tune in some way, right? So the tune, depending on the tune, there would be more or less overall structure, but they all had like some kind of overall structure.
Yeah.
And within that, I wanted to see what would happen if it was a little more open for, you know, you can get this openness in a trio that's harder in a larger, even a quartet or a quintet, when things start to get more arranged. So I wanted to explore that tension, or, you know, that relationship between the structure, but the openness of the trio. And also, just as a trombonist, I was like, okay, what's going to happen if I put myself in this situation where I'm the only horn and I have to kind of carry the thing? I figured it would be a good challenge for me as a musician to see what I could do with that. So
yeah, I love it. There's no harmonic instrument because it's so much freedom, you know.
Yeah,
trombone could be like such a cool lead voice, you know. That I love.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, it's such an amazing sound.
Yeah,
that's funny that it's, you know, it's not in the public ear as much for whatever reason.
Yeah, bizarre.
I mean, it kind of used to be like back in the era of the big bands, you know, trombone players were like rock stars, right?
Yeah.
Glenn Miller and Tommy Dorsey and Cy Zentner and whoever else, you know. I mean, all these guys were like, you know, huge pop stars of their time, right? And that sound of the trombone, that kind of singing sound, you know, that was one thing that the horn can do really well. But it does so many other things too. That's what's amazing about it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like you know, really every instrument is like that, especially in this music. People find ways to have this huge palette of expression with saxophone or trumpet or guitar or whatever, piano, whatever it is. So the trombone is like that too, but it's physically demanding. I don't know if it's physically more demanding. Maybe it is, because of the amount of air that it takes.
Probably, yeah. I mean, yeah.
And it's this physically awkward contraption, you know. I mean, it's just kind of difficult to manipulate. On the one hand, it's easy, right? You only have one moving part. I mean, the principle of operation is very simple. It's this design that goes back literally to the 16th century. I think it hasn't basically changed that much since then. And so it's this marvelously simple idea that has survived for centuries because it's so like simple and perfect in its way, right? But then that means if you want to do more complex things on it, you know, you can find ways to adapt to it, but it wasn't originally designed for that. But it's turned out to be adaptable to all these different kinds of things. Yeah, it's a marvelous instrument, really. You know?
Yeah, yeah, well, absolutely. Like you said, you wanted to write tunes, you know, and since then, you know, I love the Flex Quartet, for instance, and the music you wrote there, like Razor Lip and Lungfish and all those tunes, like. But what's your story when composing? I mean, how do you compose usually? Like piano, trombone, or do you have like snippets you write down, or what's your process there?
I have tons of snippets that I write down that are just like all over the place. That usually I write them down and then I forget about them, and then much later they're all in a couple of folders like collected, and then there's little notebooks and they're all full of these snippets. And sometimes they're literally snippets. There'll be like a little piece of paper that.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah. So I have tons of that sitting around, and what usually happens is that nothing ever happens with it. You know? And then if I have to like write some music for a project, sometimes I'll go back and like look through those a little bit, but I basically never use those. I just like come up, like if I have to write some new stuff, then I'll just sit down and start from scratch and write some new stuff. Yeah. And for a long time, I was writing on guitar. That was kind of my main way of writing. When I had to write stuff, I would sit down with a guitar, and that's what I would use to come up with ideas and try to write things. I've tried to get away from that more lately for some reason, but it still works. You know, sometimes if I'm stuck, I can like pick up a guitar, even a bass guitar, and you know, because it's coming from the body rather than from the head, you get different ideas that way.
Yeah. Interesting.
I mean, I don't play piano with any facility or anything, but I have some keyboards, and sometimes I'll try things out there. And that, for me at least, you know, I get different kinds of ideas depending on whether I'm just sitting there thinking about stuff, or whether I'm working with a trombone, or working with a guitar, or working with a keyboard. I get different kinds of things.
Mm.
Yeah. And then in the last few years, I started using notation software, instead of pencil and paper. And that lets you try things out in a different way too.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely not the kind of composer who just sits down at a desk and purely just pulls it out of my brain. I'm sure some people do that, but I'm not like that. I have to interact with some kind of physical sounding medium in order to get something to happen.
Yeah.
So what'll happen is I'll come up, my process is not sophisticated really in any way. So I'll just have to come up with a germ of an idea that I like. And then I try to think about how to work with that or how to develop it, in a nutshell. In a nutshell, that's it.
Have you been writing recently for a new project? I mean, composing as well, or?
Not super recently. Right now, I'm trying to work on an arrangement for this trombone tour that's coming up. There's this piece that Johannes Bauer did. My understanding is he had a kind of residency somewhere, and he did a piece that I don't think was ever released, as far as I know. I've looked for it. I don't think it's out there. But Matthias Müller, my colleague in the trio, had a copy of it, and he played it for me one time. And it's Johannes overdubbing himself on a bunch of trombones.
Oh, okay.
That's cool. and even a couple of tubas are in there. But it's definitely a composition. It's a very composed piece. So it's like these chunks of stuff that happen, and it's clearly, he was in his musical life, he was really mainly a free improviser, but this is very much a composed thing. And there's two versions of it. He did like a recording of him with all this overdubbing. And then there's another version, the same track, but with him improvising on top of it. Right. But what interested me was the composed thing, because I liked the material and it was unusual to see that side of him. So I'm trying to do an arrangement of this piece for a larger ensemble that we're going to do in Chicago. And the piece on the recording he made is just trombones, but I'm expanding it with other instruments besides just trombones.
Man. Beautiful.
Yeah. So, well, if it comes out well, we'll have a recording, and maybe there'll be a release sometime of that. Yeah. So that's the current thing I'm trying to think about. In terms of composing for other stuff, lately there's been a trio that I've been working on lately with Tim Daisy on drums and Mark Feldman on violin, who lives in Chicago. He lives in Chicago now. Yeah, we got. Not long after I moved to Chicago, a little over a year ago, we started getting together at Tim's and just playing without even, worrying about a gig or anything at first. And I started bringing in some material for that pretty quickly. And then we ended up having a couple of gigs, and we did a recording it's been mastered now. I think Tim's going to release it on his label pretty soon. So you should look out for that. And I've been writing some stuff for that. So, yeah. So that's the other thing.
But you're now near Boston, or are you in Chicago?
No, we moved back to Chicago. That's confusing. Okay. But we were in, my wife and I lived in Boston for 6.5 years. Okay. And then we moved back to Chicago a little over a year ago.
Okay.
So I'm coming to you from Chicago here.
Okay. Right now. I thought you were still on the East Coast.
No, we were in Boston for a while, and that's where we went through the worst part of the pandemic. And then moved out here, a little over a year ago. So
beautiful.
Back in Chicago.
Mark must have been a nice addition, right, to the scene, Feldman?
He's such an amazing musician with incredible range of experience and different kinds of things that he does and has done. And so I feel really fortunate to have, gotten involved with that pretty much as soon as I got here. So that's been really nice. Yeah. And Chicago is still a great city for music, and there's a lot going on and a lot of great players. And now there's, newer and younger players around who weren't here when I left. We were gone. My wife and I were gone from Chicago for about 10 years. So a lot happened in that time. And so I still feel like I'm kind of reorienting myself. I have all these existing connections to musicians who were here before, but then I'm trying to go out and check out people I didn't know and try to make some new connections and try to figure out how I'm going to proceed. It took me a minute after we landed here to kind of get settled and sorted just logistically. And eventually I found a really good spot not far from where we live where I have an office that I can practice in and have rehearsals in and all this stuff. So that's creatively a big help for me, I think, to have a place where I can go and concentrate on stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
So I think, my attention is kind of focused now on making sure this tour happens and getting through that. And then once that's done, things kind of open up for me in a way that means that I'm going to turn my attention more to trying to find some new stuff to work on and organize. So I need to do that.
Yeah. I mean, do you have already something in the schedule like for 2024 or like some record dates or touring or coming to Europe? I mean, do you have plans to coming to Europe or?
There isn't any kind of fixed plan, man, after this tour, which I've been putting all my mental thought into. I mean, this record with Tim and Mark is going to come out pretty soon.
Yeah.
But touring wise, no. It would be good to do another tour in Europe with the trombones maybe next year. There was a project that I had in Berlin that I want to try to revisit with some Berlin musicians as a quartet recording. And I want to try to next go back to that and try to figure out how to get that out there. And I would like to go back and work with those guys again. So, but no, right now I don't have anything on the calendar unless I'm forgetting something, but I don't think I am for next year. Yeah.
Cool, Jeb. I think we covered a lot, so
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So, thanks for sharing some of this stuff, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm really glad that you approached me about doing this. That was a pleasant surprise to.
Oh man, I have you on so many records, I was like, Jeb, come on. And it's like,
well, thank you, man. I appreciate that. It's really good to hear that, because sometimes doing this music, as I'm sure it can be hard to feel like anybody's even paying attention, or it's like, why am I doing this? Because I'm not making a lot of money from it, so why am I doing it? Right. And it's really great to know that people are aware of it and listen to it and appreciate it. So
I'm happy that you say that also, because I have the same thought so many times, man. I mean, I'm like, oh shit, again, but something drives us, I guess. So
it can be hard. You can't not do it,
Exactly.
But it makes it a lot more enjoyable, and you get a sense of, okay, I'm doing something worthwhile when you realize that other people really do hear it and appreciate it. So I'd like to express my gratitude to you for that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you too.